So Millridge exists here in southeast Fayette County on what was originally, at least in our family, part of Beaumont Farm. Beaumont grew to be Beaumont and a farm called La Belle Farm, grew to be about 4,000 acres. And my great-grandfather came back to help run that general ag farm, predominantly tobacco, cattle, corn, soybean, general ag purpose. My grandmother, Alice Headley Chandler, is the fourth child of Hal Price Headley, but she is the oldest of his second marriage. His first wife passed away, and when he remarried a woman named Genevieve Malloy, my grandmother was the first born of that next crop, if you will. But as I generally understand how the farm was laid out, how Beaumont Farm was laid out, was that a lot of the intense farming was closer to town, and this was a lot more of the pasture land. And so my grandmother, as being one of six, she grew up on all this land and grew up, well, to get around it, you learned to ride a horse and you were on horseback, and she had such an affinity for horses and whatever her father was doing. And so thoroughbreds were really her father, Hal Price Headley's, kind of pastime and passion and kind of, the game that he thought he could compete with. And so she took a love for horses, took a love of the farm, took a love of the land. And by 1960, she'd been married, she was on her second marriage, had 4 children, and they were living in Houston. And her best friend in Houston, who actually shares a birthday with her, Mrs. Josephine Abercrombie's father was establishing Pin Oak. And so my grandmother had befriended Josephine in Houston, and they were coming up to Lexington. And by 1960, my grandmother was like, I'm bringing the kids, we're moving back to Kentucky, and we're gonna get into farming. And so because this piece of the Beaumont farm was so far away from the city of Lexington, my grandmother was so keen to keep raising horses here, she and my great-grandfather started Millridge, technically named it in 1961. I think they registered it with some farm registry at that point. We have a little certificate that shows that. But in doing so, the thought was that it was going to be on the land furthest away from the city, and that they then set out to lay out the land and the farm to raise horses with the intent of just raising thoroughbreds. My grandmother, when she started the farm, had a tremendous stroke of fortune in the first few years and foaled a horse named Sir Ivor. In fact, Sir Ivor was born, and the story goes his mother, Attica, was foaling Sir Ivor, and Attica was 12 years old when she had Sir Ivor. And she hadn't really produced before that. She'd missed a couple years, and then she has Sir Ivor. And in today's market, 12-year-old mares that haven't produced anything are, they're moved on very quickly. And so here, my grandmother, kept at it, and I think it was partially because she inherited land and 4 mares and not really any money, so she had to make do with what she was given. It wasn't like she could go and upgrade her stock or whatever. She had to play the cards dealt. And so she bred Attica to Sir Gaylord, I think to try and inject some speed into the family, and Sir Ivor was born. And he grew into a lovely yearling and was sold in September of his yearling year at Keeneland to Raymond Guest. Via Bull Hancock. Bull Hancock represented Mr. Guest. So I set that story, and now he goes to train with Vincent O'Brien. And so at that time, there wasn't a lot of American-bred trade to Europe. And so Sir Ivor became the first American-bred sold auction to win the Epsom Derby, but he was a very well-regarded 2-year-old as well. And when he won the Derby, my grandmother was there. The Queen, at the same, is a similar age to my grandmother, and so the Queen was, infatuated with racing and was impressed with the fact that this woman in Kentucky had bred this amazing horse, who at the time Sir Ivor kind of captured the imaginations of the Europeans. He was, certainly very highly time form rated. Lester Piggott still to this day says he was one of the best horses he ever rode, and so his immense talent coming from this little farm in Kentucky, the Queen being, really interested in racing. If you've seen The Crown, you know the, the great love affair. And it led the Queen to come to Kentucky to try and learn more about it, and then led a great relationship between Her Majesty and my grandmother. But that said, so the Queen came to visit in, 89, I think it was, 88 or 89. And I think that was also the founding of the Queen Elizabeth II race. And so, anyway, I was old enough, just on the cusp of being old enough, and still probably not given the great confidence that I was old enough to meet Her Majesty when she came to visit. And I don't remember the moment that is, I guess, made famous, or that we have photographed. I was more interested in the Secret Service and their walkie-talkies on their watches, and and the repetitive nature of my dad. My mom drove us here, and my dad leaning back in the station wagon from the front seat and making me shake his hand, shake my hand, squeeze, too tight, not tight enough. This is how you shake a hand. The whole way, for 30 minutes I was given a crash course in how to shake a hand, because the last thing he wanted is to be embarrassed by me shaking your hand, which I get a kick out of. We have a photo of this moment, and the Queen and I are in a lovely exchange of pleasantries, and Dad's lip is fairly pursed and his teeth are he's kind of gritting his teeth because he's not wanting to make sure I don't screw it up. So it's too funny. We've had tremendous fortune in raising incredible horses for generations, and in the early 80s, my grandmother and my Uncle Reynolds acquired adjacent land, and what is today Mill Ridge was laid out by them at that time. They engaged a gentleman named Horst Schock, who was head of landscape architecture at the University of Kentucky, to lay the farm out. And I think it's one of the most uniquely laid out farms, and is very intentionally laid out by a landscape architect, where he wanted it, or they wanted it, so the only road you saw was the road you were on. And so as you start at the bottom of kind of a little gully, you rise up a hill, and then you end up on the top of kind of the ridge line. And so as you look out over the farm, you don't see other roads, and there's this great intrigue of how fences dive over rises, or dive under rises, and then rise up, and there's a mystery to it all. And so Horst and my grandmother and uncle were key in what the farm is today, which I really think is one of the most special pieces of land. My grandma would give 80% of the credit to the horses we've raised to the land, and so would welcome anyone to come out and see it and see for yourself.